Okay. Water. I still can't get over BL's reaction to soul ray 7 and personality ray 3 to just send her into paroxysms. It's so important that laughter be a part of this process, you know, because it integrates it into our consciousness, you know. Okay, this is kind of the second half of BL's two-part presentation, really, because the technique of fusion is very much oriented towards fusing the soul and personality, whereas the technique of integration is oriented towards preparing for that process. But they're not rigid lines between the two. This presentation will feature the artwork of Agnes Pelton, an intuitive artist from the early 20th century. And you saw some of her works in BL's presentation. And I think you'll find that the paintings, her paintings, have an uncanny ability to illustrate the abstract meaning behind DK's words. I really made an effort to link up what I'm talking about with Agnes's artwork. And so just stay open to that idea that, you know, what's being described is also being pictured. And I was pleasantly surprised at how close the ideas melded. Right. Okay, so the technique of fusion is the second of three techniques given by DK, which together form really one great process. So we have first the sevenfold technique of integration, which is applied during the path of probation, and I have to put an asterisk here because what I found is that what DK says they apply to is actually kind of downgrading of what they actually apply to. That the technique of integration goes well into the early initiations, and the technique of fusion goes well up into the higher initiations. And he calls that level discipleship, right? The technique of fusion is applied to discipleship, and third, the technique of duality is applied to initiation, is what he says, but from his description, I think they're the higher initiations, the fourth and fifth, and even beyond. But, you know, before we get into this, we might first ask, why are these techniques necessary? What personality condition do these techniques address? One answer might be, personalities are inherently trapped by the sense of individual separative identity, called in Sanskrit ahamkara, here personified by the coils of the Egyptian serpent Apep. It wasn't an evil serpent, it was just all of the ramifications of personality identification, right, which they understood. This separative perspective holds us captive by means of maya, glamour, and illusion. But through the synthesizing energy pouring in through the three techniques of integration, fusion, and duality, we are able to dispel this separative sense caused by our identification with form life. So, what is the technique of fusion, and how does it differ from the technique of integration? Actually, all three techniques have the same synthesizing influence, the same, you could say, fundamental force which comes from the soul. But they work at different levels. For example, whereas the goal of the technique of integration is to heal the cleavages between the personality sheaths in order to create one integrated unit of consciousness, which is empowered by and expressive of the personality ray, the technique of fusion takes the process a step further by healing the cleavage between the personality and soul, and thus enabling the indweller to be expressive of both soul and personality rays. In essence, the technique of fusion itself is an advanced form of meditation that gradually builds a constant and unremitting control of the soul over the personality. Addressing the fact that initially, at least, only a few disciples find themselves ready to engage in this technique, DK says, you might well ask me here, of what profit is it then for me to write these things at all? I would reply, there are a few today, and there will be an increasing number in the next 2 decades who, grasping the beauty of the presented idea, and that's a very specific thing that we'll talk about later, will be urged by their souls to work towards these ends. And this is the one that really got me. It's why I included this quote. By so doing, they will succeed in raising the consciousness of the entire human family. So that's why he included this teaching. So, though most, if not all of us, as aspirants and probationary disciples are still primarily working with the technique of integration, as soon as the soul begins to substantially influence our meditations, the energy that animates the technique of fusion will begin to come into play. As its fusing energy continues to pour in, the personality ray becomes increasingly responsive to the soul ray. That's the process, leading eventually to soul infusion, which DK tells us happens at the 3rd initiation, at which time an unimpeded channel will have been created between the soul, the mental body, and the brain, through which the soul can implement its purpose in the 3 worlds of human activity. However, we're not there yet. During the earlier stages of this soul influence, its inflow creates a struggle between the energies of the personality, represented by the lower half of this painting, and soul rays, which is only resolved when the disciple finally acquiesces to soul control. This happens through a sustained 3-fold battle between the dweller on the threshold, which is the fully developed personality, and the angel of the presence. At this stage on the path, the personal self has become highly developed and has thus, from the soul perspective, become a potentially useful instrument, a potential agent for service. But before this can happen, the personality must acquiesce to soul control. For many lives leading up to this final great crisis, the disciple has been dwelling on the threshold between spirit and matter, hence the name, dweller on the threshold. During these many lives, the aspirant becomes increasingly sensitized to the presence of the angel. And it is through this developed sensitivity that the door of initiation can be approached. But before a disciple can actually pass through the door, he or she must cross 3 successive burning grounds. These burning grounds are the means by which the angel of the presence, here represented by the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, confronts the dweller, who is the developed, integrated personality. This confrontation results in a bringing to the surface of all the unresolved problems, all the undeclared desires, all the latent characteristics and qualities, all the phases of thought and self-will, and all the lower potencies and ancient habits, both good and bad, that have been developed over eons of lifetimes. The purpose of bringing forth these ancient characteristics? Simply to break their control, so that the dweller can see them for what they are, make the choice to submit to the fire of purification, and at the same time acquiesce to, in this case, it would be the influence of Sekhmet, which is the solar presence. Which happens not through one great battle, but during the 3 periods prior to each of the first 3 initiations. For only by crossing the burning ground 3 successive times are all impediments to the free use of one's spiritual will destroyed. It's progressive, right? You do some of the work having to do with the physical plane. At the first initiation, the huge work preparing for the second, where you release yourself from the glamour of the astral plane. And then very quickly after that, one progresses through the illusion or illusionary field that the lower mind presents. The result of this, the personality ray truly becomes in consciousness a subray of the soul ray. That's the goal. DK says, I would call your attention to the fact that it is at a midway point that the great submission of the lower to the higher takes place. It does not happen when the disciple hovers uncertainly upon the periphery of the burning ground, or when he stands before the door with the burning ground experience behind him. The essential point of crisis, producing the needed point of tension, is the result of the invocative decision of the personality, which in time produces an evocative response from the angel. The 2 factors involved, and forget not, my brother, that all this takes place within the field of the consciousness of the disciple, moves together towards each other. In the center of the burning ground, they meet. And then the lesser light, a true light in its own right, of the personality is absorbed into the greater light of the angel or soul. The angel, therefore, occultly obliterates the dweller, who becomes lost to sight in the radiant aura of the angel. I couldn't help but include that quote. So, the burning ground has done its work, and the personality is now nothing more or less than the purified shell through which the light of the angel of the presence shines. It is actually a fusion of lights, with the stronger and more powerful obliterating the lesser. This new harmonious relationship is the first major goal of the technique of fusion. From this point onwards, the soul ray determines the goal, which is then carried out by the personality using the style and methods characteristic of the personality ray. The personality is still there. The form and style of the 3 personality vehicles are still ruled by the personality ray. But the motive and resulting sense of purpose that guide one's service is now expressed through the soul ray, because the light of the angel now envelops all aspects of the personality ray expression. Okay, but let's back up just a bit and take a look at what leads up to the technique of fusion. The process of healing the cleavages between the physical, emotional, sentient, and mental energies that takes place during the technique of integration eventually creates such a potent vortex that a fourth expression, which DK simply calls the personality, emerges from the three lesser energy fields. It is this realized potency, initially brought into conscious activity through the technique of integration, that finally completes the process of becoming as it relates to the fourfold lower man. The personality then truly has done its work. It's important to understand the difference between the three energy systems that form the personality and this fourth factor, the personality in its own right, which, though it uses its three lesser vehicles to express itself, is more than just a composite of these lesser three. For it is from this fourth factor that the personality ray comes into being as a bridging mechanism for the soul to make use of in its effort to contact the lesser lives that the personality has synthesized. When these four energies are acting as one expression through the personality ray, their combined force invokes the soul. The ensuing contact then brings into play a fifth and still higher energy field, which, using the technique of fusion, acts as the catalyst for the other four, eventually resulting in an integrated, unified, fivefold field of magnetic activity. DK gives us a clue to the nature of this fifth field when he describes the five together as, quote, a fusion of the four forces and one energy, suggesting that it is this fifth field that bridges the soul and personality, increases their interplay, initiates a fusing potency, and when the four lesser vehicles are rightly related to each other, finally produces one unified active force field. So the same energy that brought about the integration of the personality continues to work, but now the consciousness of the indweller has shifted and is responding to the soul energy, and as a result, this interplay between the soul on its own plane and the fused personality, the integrated personality, comes alive. The focus has shifted from healing the cleavages to this new fusion with the soul, right? Now, I think there's an overlap. I don't think you reach 100% mark in terms of healing all the personality cleavages, and that was Sunday, and now it's Monday morning, and it's, you then begin your process of soul integration. I think you begin to bring in this energy from the technique of fusion before you've finished completely with the technique of integration. But you will be in the later stages of that, before that other energy becomes available to you. So the four then, when they're integrated, create this fifth, and it's this fivefold energy field that enables its soul to work through any of the lower sheaths in whatever combination is best suited for the work at hand. For example, a scientist or surgeon at this level of integration may work primarily through the mental and physical sheaths, right? A surgeon, for instance, very mentally active and aware, but also physically at the highest skill level. The emotional level, the astral, is not part of this process so much, right? A poet or composer might express soul through the mental and astral sheaths, right? No real physical effort needed, but a deep sensitivity will need to have been developed at the astral, forging that connection with the Buddhic plane, and therefore allowing that wonderful down source to infuse his poetry or his music or whatever. A temple dancer, and we've had one in this conference, may need to integrate all three chis, right? Express soul through the mental, astral, and physical simultaneously, the mental because of the inner discipline and alignment, the astral through the feeling quality that is animates the temple dancing, and of course the extraordinary physical skills necessary to actually dance dance effectively and to really ground soul all the way to the physical plane. So from this unified fivefold field, a note begins to emerge, which, growing in strength over successive lifetimes, eventually reveals the full potential of the personality ray. As this, we tend to underplay the importance of the personality ray. A fully developed personality ray is a very spiritually charged thing because it doesn't stand isolated and on its own. By being integrated and expressive, it is inherently already being touched by soul potency. As this ray gains in strength under the impress of the soul, it begins to shine through the personality vehicle with an ever-increasing beauty and potency. When the personality ray becomes expressive of its highest qualities, and these are going to be personality ray qualities, right? The fivefold unit begins to consciously merge with the energies of the soul. And instead of just being impressed by, there's an merging of the influence of the two rays. And it does so by means of the now unified energy field of the personality ray. The method of merging is through the energy of the personality ray. The work has to be done from below upwards. It's not the soul, pulling you up by the rope and it's, you're climbing, right? And you're doing so through a perfected personality ray expression, At this stage, the personality ray is no longer expressive of any separative notes. That all has been healed through all those healing of the cleavages. And thus there is no longer any resistance to the influence of the soul. This energetic through flow actually transmutes the vibratory quality of the personality ray into the higher note of the soul ray, without losing the unique qualities of form and style that the personality ray expresses. Now blending into one, the image that just came to mind was a petrified seashell. It's like there's nothing left of that original animal, but it's in the exact same form that original animal was, So it's like completely infused, but it has the outer form of its previous existence, So now blended into one expression, the soul-infused personality is no longer energetically oriented towards the lower self, and thus seeks only to more effectively serve the plan. So we might think that when we reach the fourth initiation and thus no longer need to incarnate, we will transcend personality expression altogether. But DK makes it clear that the soul-infused personality continues to be used by those higher beings who serve humanity. Even the Christ has a personality ray, which we learn in Destiny of Nations is on the sixth ray. I said he had a sixth ray mind, and that wasn't correct because I would have done my homework here. So it's a sixth ray personality. That means it was probably a first ray mind to you, just so you know. In fact, we are told that even planets have a ray-conditioned personality expression, which we might hypothesize becomes a subray of its soul ray when that planet becomes a sacred planet. But I think we're well beyond our pay grade here in terms of actually knowing what any of this is about, But, our Earth is at that cusp, right? We are a third-ray personality right on the cusp of a fourth cosmic initiation to become a sacred planet, which will be expressive of the second ray, which is an extraordinary thing, at which time we'll have second ray expression just as a flow through, which is one reason I think we're so interesting to the solar logos, being a second ray solar system, right? But expressive at a third ray level of intelligent activity. What a glorious thing to imagine, That's just taking, the love of God and expressing it right into the physical form. And, every aspect of humanity will be transformed by that through flow, a second through third, into the environment of the planet, right? Okay, again, backing up a bit, who can benefit from the conscious use of the technique of fusion? DK tells us that the disciple who is definitely aware of his or her personality power, which is itself a sign of a rapidly integrating personality, is beginning to come under increased soul influence, which by definition means that the energy of synthesis that comes through the technique of fusion is beginning to be felt, right? But in addition to this, one who is quote unquote centering in the place of light and thus orienting him or herself to soul contact is definitely preparing for soul integration through the technique of fusion. DK tells us that at this stage, the mind, when it is the controlling personality factor, is itself brought, quote, suddenly and dynamically under the control of the soul. But for this to happen, the disciple must also be free from the deluding reactions of the solar plexus center, and thus have become mentally polarized rather than simply mentally focused. And I think we have we can definitely draw an analogy between these two techniques and the shift from the solar plexus to the heart. This is, you could say that in the process of this solar plexus to heart shift, we invite in the energy of the technique of fusion, because the impersonal aspect of heart energy, which is second ray energy, displaces the personality focus. And that is the technique of fusion's process. Okay, so DK gives us a series of motives. It says requirements. One motive is to eventuate soul control, that one must be in this place. To serve in response to a felt realization of humanity's needs. This is definitely a movement into the heart. And to cooperate with the plan in response to an intelligent, which also means conscious, appreciation of its nature and existence, right? So you can see the decentralization necessary here in all of these prerequisites. These three motives are on a higher turn of the spiral than the purificatory and integrative purposes of the technique of integration, as it applies purely to the lower sheaths. In fact, these motives can't truly influence the disciple until the personality is under soul impress. Okay. Technique of fusion demonstrates through the three major rays of will, love, and active intelligence. However, disciples upon the minor rays also employ one or other of these three major ray techniques. First and fifth ray disciples use the first ray technique. Second and fourth and sixth ray disciples employ the second ray technique. And presumably, though DK doesn't specifically say, seventh ray disciples also use the third ray technique. But since we don't know what these techniques are yet, you just have to hold that to the side. We're told that in order to prepare ourselves for this technique and the direct soul contact that it involves, all disciples, this is interesting, take on a third-ray personality for a number of lives prior to the first initiation, at which time this technique begins to be utilized. I thought that was quite interesting, to take on a third-ray personality for a number of lives, because it is the third ray that best facilitates transmutation of the lesser energies into those more aligned with the taking of the first initiation. It becomes a very effective tool once there is soul impress, and it pulls it out of its aimless busyness, right? Then it becomes a very effective tool for resolving the various pairs of opposites that you have to work through before personality control can be broken. The effect on disciples who engage in the technique of fusion is illumination of the mind via the higher mental subplanes, thus revealing the fact of the soul itself. I'll take it. This comes through an evocation of the will. So a lot of connection between mind and will. You'll notice in DK's teaching that 1 in 5 connection is very strong. 2, an increasingly creative and dynamic imagination, which stimulates the sense of relationship, resulting, curiously, in a strong sense of responsibility. This comes through the evocation of love. And then we have 3, a form of inspiration that permeates one's physical life, reaching right down into the physical body via the brain and revealing the capacity to cooperate intelligently with the plan. This comes through an evocation of the intelligence aspect. This last quality is definitely aligned with the energy of Sagittarius, which rules both the physical body and the higher mental plane, as well as that stage in meditation called inspiration. When one is thus inspired, the life of the disciple, DK tells us, becomes immersed in the vitality of the plan, becomes resilient, elevated, and is no longer held back by the form aspect in any way. This is what is meant by the phrase, her cup runneth over. This threefold descent of will, love, and intelligence is actually a superimposition. We're going into theosophy nerd land here for a minute. It's a superimposition of the energy of the spiritual triad on the mental, astral, and physical sheaths of the initiate. Higher mind descends via the brain to control the physical body, bringing inspiration to one's physical plane life. Love descends from Buddhic levels via the soul to consciously control the astral or desire sentient body, thereby enlivening one's creative imagination. And will descends from atmic levels to control higher mind, bringing triadal illumination. In this way, the technique of fusion brings the potency of all three aspects of the spiritual triad into direct control of the lower three bodies. This triadal influence expands the disciple's consciousness to include all five of the lower subplanes of the cosmic physical plane, eventually leading to perfected consciousness on these five lower planes at the fifth and sixth initiations. Okay, so how is a superimposition of the energy of the spiritual triad on the mental, astral, and physical sheaths initiated? No matter which ray technique the disciple and / initiate is destined to use, he or she must begin by invoking the will aspect via the mind. This has a direct effect on the center at the base of the spine, stimulating it to respond to certain chakras, the particular chakra depending on the ray technique that's being employed. DK tells us, quote, when the rays are understood, you have the possibility of a new system of awakening the centers. This Kundalini arousal under first ray Vulcan is part of that ray's illuminating process, wherein the mind is galvanized with monadic purpose. At the same time that this downflow is going on, a stimulation of the imagination, lifting it from a purely astral expression through an infusion via the soul of pure love, which in turns open the imaginative faculty to impressions from the higher world. This downflow forcefully affects the heart center, awakens it into full activity. That which comes through the imagination is then channeled through the disciple's creative intelligence into some form of outer expression, which in turn stimulates and activates the throat center. So no matter which ray technique is being followed, the base of the spine, heart, and throat centers are awakened and eventually brought into full functioning activity. Of course, later in the process, all of the centers become fully active, but these three are the gateway through the technique of fusion. Okay, let's take a look at the effects that occur as a result of using each of the three ray techniques of fusion. Beginning with the first ray technique, which we're told is used by both first and fifth ray disciples. Though true of all three ray techniques, DK emphasizes the importance during this first ray technique of evoking the divine will, which creates a line of descent first from the monad to the atmic permanent atom, then from there to the tier of petals of the egoic lotus, as well as to the will petals of the love and knowledge tiers, then from there to the mental sheath, and from there to the brain, both etheric and dense, the latter being like a shadow of the mental sheath on the physical plane. And finally, back up to the etheric base of the spine. So it's all the way from the will aspect of the monad right down into the brain, and then back up to the base of the spine center. When successfully implemented, this line of descent anchors spiritual will. We're talking about this first ray technique. It anchors spiritual will on the physical plane, thereby activating the intuition, which demonstrates not only as direct knowledge, but also as illumination, the, quote, light of life itself. It is this light of the Creator that guides our creative intelligence. A disciple endowed with an atmically illumined mind sees all manifestation, all diversification in terms of the creative light from which it came. The first ray quality of this revelation comes through seeing all things as a unity of light, of knowing that the homogeneity of the universe is light. From this perspective of unity in and through light, we gain some understanding of the keynote of this first ray technique called isolated unity. Did I say this was going to be a really simple thing to understand? If I did. Sorry about that if I said that. It's not. But it's a, this technique encapsulates every method of moving from personality to soul infusion. You know, you could say it's the science of this process that we're all involved in. You know, we can see it unfolding through, you know, the raising of the kundalini or the opening of the egoic petals. This is another language for the same process, right? But it's a very particular and scientific approach. So, you know, I apologize, you know, if it feels like I should have handed out machetes, you know, before we started, you know, because it is dense. But, you know, if... Yeah, well, when I went through each of these techniques, let's see, what happened? Yeah, that's a problem. Okay. So, isolated unity, which is the key word of this first technique. DK describes it as a state of consciousness which sees the whole as one, and in which the initiate, not theoretically, but as a realized fact, is identified with that whole. So there, you know, it's a circumscribed whole. For instance, it could just be a group. You know, if you actually have the direct experience of the unity of this group, you're experiencing a form of isolated unity, right? If you in the knowingness in you embraces this group and makes the individual secondary, right? Then you have achieved a form of isolated unity. Okay. By the way, it is the whole which is isolated in the consciousness of the initiate, not the initiate who regards him or herself as isolated. That's more like a first-rate personality, right? Okay, unity with the whole is, of course, progressively realized. At first expressing itself as unity with one's group, this, as I was just saying, and then through the power conferred at each successive initiation. Because remember, say you're on a first-ray technique of fusion path, every initiation unfolds greater levels of awareness along the lines of this technique, right? So if you are in this isolated unity process, then at each initiation you experience a greater and greater inclusive awareness, right? Until finally, you embrace the entire living structure of the whole solar system. There's not a single sentient life in the solar system that you're not identified with, as it's part of the whole. I mean, this is unimaginable. We need to back up because I'm getting a nosebleed here, right? I mean, you can really imagine that the Dalai Lama has this quality, doesn't he? He identifies with this, with the people in this auditorium, with the group that represents what he embraces. That's his isolated unity. It's not the whole solar system, yet. He's not, after all, a planetary logos or something. He is, this great master in form. But you get a sense of how the expansiveness of this, right, through the initiations. Okay. Okay, this expansion isn't possible for personality working on its own. It's always brought about through the soul meditating in concert with the personality. I love this painting. To me, this is a perfect example of the soul-infused personality that is directly oriented towards the soul. Anyway, for only the soul has the ability to identify with an ever-expanding unity. Right? Its personality can't do that. When this meditation is successfully carried out, the effects are: 1, illumination of the mind, resulting in a gradual revelation of the plan, which leads to at-one-ment with the universal mind. 2nd, stimulation of the creative imagination, resulting in ways to creatively cooperate with and not just be an obedient servant of, right? Get the difference? The plan. You become an active creator in the process of carrying the plan out into the physical plane, into the lower quaternary, right? You're not just whatever you say, just tell me and I'll do it. That's not it. It's creative imagination bringing forth that which will make of this desert a garden, right? And then 3rd, a close cooperation with the custodians of the plan in service to humanity. Basically, the hierarchy is a great group of creators who, through active imagination, are determining the evolution of our planet, right? And trying to get through to us so that we can actually implement that on the physical plane. These effects become progressively more potent during discipleship and the first 3 initiations. The qualities of growth described in this list reveals that reveal the technique of integration and fusion are in fact just a particular way of describing the path of becoming. The first ray technique of fusion involves the use of the head center. Eventually focuses the initiate's consciousness in the spiritual triad, while at the same time preserving soul, mind, and brain consciousness. So there's an upward reaching into atmic levels, but never losing the link, the downward link into the brain. That's the difference between the mystic and the occultist. It's very much an occult path that holds the grounded brain in service while ascending in order to gain a further understanding of the plan to bring that down. This unbroken flow from triad to personality vehicles is one of the hallmarks of these techniques, all three techniques, really. An old commentary describes this connection as, quote, okay, you need to stand on one foot to get this one, because it's old commentary, right? And whatever part of the brain that works the best. The intensest reflection of the man isolated in God, who is the negation of isolation, that's the God part, and is nevertheless the whole, which is set apart from other wholes. Okay, so I spent a while trying to interpret this, and so what I came up with is that the meditator, quote unquote, isolates him or herself through identification with some greater whole. For instance, a group, right? Which, because it is a unity, completely negates the idea of isolation, but which nevertheless represents a whole set apart from other wholes. This group compared to another group, for instance, right? And it's set apart only because the unity achieved by the initiate is a necessarily limited experience of unity, right? Said more simply, isolated unity is the gained awareness of some particular whole or unity whose ring past not is determined by the initiate's awareness. DK tells us that when this stage of awareness has been achieved, the disciple becomes impervious to all pulls, to all magnetic energies originating from the physical plane, because the disciple can now draw on his or her higher aspects, not only subjectively and unconsciously, but in full waking understanding awareness. Which brings us to this important point. There's a huge difference in the nature, scope, and quality of the service rendered by one who is overshadowed by the spiritual triad, and the aspirant who is based in personality level full cooperation, because the service rendered by the one who has contacted the source of the light of the triad, called here by Agnes Pelton the blessed, flows freely and spontaneously, carrying with it soul illumination. And that just cannot be achieved by the personality. And no matter how ardent that personality may be and willing, it must be the soul expressing itself through the personality. This is why DK says, and this is among the top 3 one-liners in the DK books, service is the spontaneous effect of soul contact. We must not forget that when working with the technique of fusion, it is contemplation by the soul that enables the disciple to consciously merge with the soul, who then, in deep meditation, this fused force, decides, plans, and works. The only personality work involved is the preparatory work. It's the clearing away of the impediments that hinder development of this reality of soul-infused consciousness, followed by an evocation of the will to become. Then the personality work stops, right? You have the will to become, you've cleared the way, and now it's up to the soul to do the further work. Okay, there's a break coming up, folks. Those who use the second rate technique of fusion produce, wait a minute, where am I here? Sorry. Yeah, okay. All right. So the effects of the disciple, the effect on the disciple of each of the ray techniques is, curiously enough, found in the qualities of the ray that follows that ray technique being used. There's no way you could understand what I just said, but I'm gonna illustrate this. When I wrote this sentence, I thought, I don't even understand what this means, you know, but the example brings it forward, okay? For example, the effects on the disciple who engaged in the first ray technique of fusion demonstrates as the second ray qualities of understanding, love, and sympathetic cooperation. Interestingly, the effects produced are always the most difficult for each given ray type to incorporate. For example, the second ray effect of loving acceptance and understanding is the most difficult for first ray disciples to develop. The same is true for each of the other two ray types. We kind of saw that in this list we were working with today. You know, for the healing quality for the first ray type was inclusion, which is anathema to the first ray personality type. So you have to develop that in order to, you could say, gain access to soul energy, right? And right down the line on all seven, you found that the key word was actually the hardest aspect for that particular ray type to incorporate, you know. So the same thing goes here. Those who use the second ray technique of fusion produce third ray effects, of which the use of one's active intelligence in order to stimulate the creative imagination is the outstanding characteristic. And again, it is these third ray qualities that are the most difficult for second ray types to incorporate. To finish the triangle, the third ray disciple, using the power to inspire, adds to his or her innate qualities certain definite first ray potencies. And again, it is these first ray qualities of will, steadfastness, and directed effort that traditionally prove so difficult for the third ray type. Thus, through the technique of fusion, that which is most challenging for each ray type is confronted and eventually assimilated. One more paragraph. We can formulate from these three effects a dynamic triangle which links the three ray techniques and whose movement comes about through these three effects. The movement from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, and from 3 to 1 supplements the inherent qualities of each ray type with certain needed qualities. Okay, that's it for part one. I can see I'm going to come back and I'm going, come on, didn't even one person stay? Oh, man. So we'll continue in a few minutes with the description of are you ready for this? The effects of those using the second ray technique of fusion, which many of us in this conference are destined to follow. That's the hooker, right? Many of us will be using this second ray technique of fusion, so you have to come back, right? Okay, so let's stretch our legs, take a few minute break, get some water, go to the bathroom, whatever. Okay, everyone, take your seats, please. Get back into this. I'm not sure what happened with the time, but we're out of it. So, okay. Yeah, we're not going there right now. I'm skipping a whole huge section, and I just want to get this idea of presented attributes. I want you to be aware of that or have some understanding of it, so I'm going to skip way down. That's near the end. So it's a third-ray version of the technique of fusion. Where are you? Come on. Okay. Sorry. All right, so the keyword for the third ray technique is presented attributes, which seems an easy enough concept to understand when we think of the word presented as meaning demonstrated or revealed, and the word attributes as the inherent or natural qualities and characteristics of someone or something. But the presented attributes to be meditated on by the third and seventh ray types are attributes contacted not by the human kingdom, but from within the kingdom of soul. So again, you have to have this soul infusion before this becomes possible. So, as with the other two techniques, only those who can function as souls will be able to gradually comprehend and bring into activity these attributes, which are only revealed through and by the fifth kingdom in nature. All right, I'm going to so through the third ray version, because I only have like 10 minutes, through the third ray version of the technique of fusion, the meditator contacts attributes that are definitely coming into expression during this fifth root race of human development. And, what is a presented attribute? Well, I'll just jump ahead to say that one of the great presented attributes was brought to us by the Christ, and that presented attribute was love, not affection, not a sympathetic understanding, but this quality of love from the Buddhic plane. And that it was presented by him, brought into the fabric of humanity, and then for the next 2,000 years, certain efforts have been made to bring it into further understanding. Another presented attribute was wisdom, which was brought in by the Buddha, right? 600 years before the Christ incarnated, he brought this in. We're still working with the beginning processes of understanding what wisdom is, because it requires that second aspect, that soul connection, to move from knowledge to wisdom, right? So I'm really paraphrasing here. It says, I want to describe the different types of attributes, because it's, let's take a moment to look at the 4 classifications of attributes. This is the last point I really want to get through. 4 classifications of attributes that have and will impact both the human and the higher kingdoms of nature. First, we have inherent attributes, which were gained and incorporated in a previous cycle of human expression. Like, for example, the ability to express oneself through language. I mean, we take that for granted, but think what an extraordinary thing that is. You know, an animal man moving from animal sounds to subtle linguistic expression. That's, yeah, communication. That is, well, communication existed before, but it was refined to a high degree by this, in what has now become an inherent attribute, right? The second group are called expressing attributes, which are in process of emerging, such as clairvoyance and the ability to know what someone else is feeling. I mean, we've all had that experience. These expressing attributes will eventually constitute humanity's major qualities, and after the evolutionary cycle has done its work, will become inherent attributes. Everyone will have these qualities such as clairvoyance, and they will be recognized as part of the human condition, right? Third are presented attributes. These are mostly latent attributes that are as yet unknown to all but a few highly developed disciples. It is apprehending these attributes that is the focus of those using the third-rate technique of fusion. Love is an example, as I said, of a revolutionary presented attribute. And it took a being like the Christ to grasp for humanity and present to humanity love's actual significance. And then we have a DK quote, which I'll skip. The fourth and highest level are called undefined attributes. This one really blew my mind, which DK tells us are those which the Christ, the planetary logos, and those great lies of whose consciousness we can have no conception are just beginning to become aware. For these attributes, there are no words, no examples, right? Or even a faintest conception of what they might be. But in millions of years, they will become presented attributes. Some great avatar will have a revelation of something as extraordinary as the attribute of love and bring it into the human fabric, which is, you know, pretty incredible. Okay. If you want to come to my room later and I'll give you this, you know, we can sit around and, okay, I'm just, all right. I think we're there, aren't we? We probably are, yeah. So I got squashed. You get your full two presentations, which is terrific. Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed the works of Agnes Pelton. Isn't she wonderful? I mean, I really, like the idea of these attributes being represented by this container. You know, I just loved the way her work synced with the ideas that EK presented. So thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. Yeah. Yes, I agree. And all those early 20th century female to a person spiritual painters had this extraordinary gift of representing these ideas. It's really wonderful. I think I'm done.
And that was in the
20s, 30s, or even up to the 50s, but the sweet spot was 20s through 40s. Let's see, Freude Captain, what was their first name? The Freude Captain was the last two names, but I forget the first one. It was in BL slides. Come on, somebody. Olga, that's it. Olga Frober-Kapteyn actually had a retreat with Alice in Switzerland. And so they definitely work together. And if you look at the names of her paintings, you can see that they're representative of DK's work, you know. Yeah.
I really love the paintings. Hi, everybody. I hope you're all awake.